What's something your parents believe that you don't?
At my sister's request, I was not invited to the family Christmas in Hawaii, and while the invitation never arrived and the group chat moved on without me with that familiar tone of forced cheer that pretends not to notice who has been pushed outside the frame, I kept my face straight, thanked my mother for keeping things simple this year, and let the whole performance land the way my family likes it to land, which is to say without confrontation, without mess, and without anyone having to. Hear me explain why this felt like the last cheap trick in a long list of them. My mother called first with a speech that had clearly been rehearsed, telling me that Emily needed a relaxed environment and that I have been a little intense lately and that everyone agrees a low-stress trip would be best. And she said it like she was reading from a parenting blog while stirring a pot, and I almost laughed, because the only time my family worries about stress is when the person feeling it is not me, so I told her I understood, and that they should have fun. And I could hear the relief wash through the phone line like I had just signed a permission slip. Then my father chimed in with his version of diplomacy, a long paragraph about how flights are expensive and schedules are complicated and maybe next year we will plan earlier. And I said I hear you and that I would not want to be the reason anyone felt uncomfortable, and he seized on that sentence like a life raft, thanking me for being reasonable and calling me a team player. Which was funny because I had never been allowed to pick the team, the game, or the rules, but sure, I can smile and nod like the mascot if that keeps the peace for one more casserole season. Emily, of course, did not call. She texted a heart and a line about needing good vibes only, which would be adorable if it were not code for silencing anyone who remembers the bill she never paid, the promise she never kept, the mess she never cleaned. And I stared at the screen for a minute too long, thinking about how people who demand good vibes tend to leave bad debts, then set the phone down and answered with a breezy no worries, because there is a special satisfaction in being underestimated by someone who thinks manipulation is the same thing as strategy. Here is the part one will only say out loud to someone I trust. It did hurt, not the trip itself because I can take myself anywhere and enjoy my own company just fine, but the brazen way they framed my absence as mature and considerate. As if I had been the problem all along, as if the years I spent fielding calls from my sister at midnight and driving across town to bail her out of the latest disaster were just me creating drama for fun. And I felt a slow burn in my chest that was not anger. Exactly, more like clarity arriving late but firm, telling me that this pattern does not change because I ask nicely, it changes because I stop playing along. I made tea, I sat at my kitchen table, and I ran through the usual scripts that used to keep me stuck. The ones where I rationalize their behavior because they are family and because Emily has had a rough stretch and because my parents are tired and because the holidays make everyone weird, and I listen to each excuse arrive and leave like buses on a schedule. And for once I did not board any of them. I just watched them roll by. There is a point in every family story where the person who keeps absorbing the blow realizes that the patting they offer is not kindness, it is a free service, and once you notice that, it is impossible to pretend you do not see the invoice piling up on your own kitchen counter, so I did something radical for me and utterly ordinary for anyone raised with boundaries. I stayed quiet. I did not plead for a seat at a table that had already been cleared of my place setting, and I started thinking about what I actually control. My mother sent another message with a packing list and a winky face. My father forwarded a confirmation number as if I needed proof of their plans. And the group chat lit up with jokes about sunscreen and luau's and a plan to surprise Dad with a fishing excursion. And I typed nothing, I posted nothing, I simply let them narrate a story where I was the problem they had expertly solved by deleting me. And while they performed relief, I sat with the simple, steady truth that choices have consequences, and when people choose distance, sometimes they discover what distance really feels like. That night I slept well, better than I had in months, not because I am a saint who rises above everything, but because I had finally stopped rehearsing arguments no one wanted to hear and started listening to the part of me that has waited a long time to act like the adult in the room. The one who understands that kindness is not a blank check and silence is not consent and love without respect is just a leash with a softer handle. By morning, the guilt had turned into something cooler and cleaner, a sense that if they wanted me quiet and far away, I could give them exactly that without tears or threats or dramatic speeches. And I could do it while protecting myself in a way I should have done years ago, which is a thought that landed with a tiny sting because it is annoying to recognize your own power after you have loaned it out for so long. But the sting felt honest. And honest is a good place to stand. I put my phone face down, opened my laptop, and took a slow breath, not to meditate or visualize light or any of the other breathing activities my sister posts about when she needs people to forget she owes them money, but to count what is mine and what is not, what I am willing to carry and what I am absolutely done lifting, and in that quiet inventory, I remembered a fact everyone else had conveniently filed under background noise, a detail so ordinary they had stopped seeing it even while living inside it every single day. They thought they had boxed me out for the holidays and taught me a lesson about humility and going along to get along, but in their excitement they forgot one small, boring, legally documented thing, and once that memory settled, the rest of the plan wrote itself, because they could fly as far as they wanted and splash in as many photos as they pleased, while back here, where real life happens, there was a front door that did not belong to them, and I was finally ready to treat it like it belonged to me. People here rent-free and think of a kind of wild generosity that must have been swept in on a wave of holiday spirit, but the truth is slower and less pretty. Because years before this Christmas mess, my sister had finished a series of bad choices with a dramatic flourish that left her without a place to sleep. And I had just closed on a small but decent house that I could afford by watching my spending like a hawk and working hours that stretched past tired, so when she called sobbing about starting over and just needing a landing pad, I opened my door and told myself it would be a brief stop, a month or two at most, and that a little kindness in the short term would keep our family from ripping itself apart in the long term. Which is a line I have repeated so many times it may as well be stitched into a pillow. The arrangement was never formal because my parents insisted formal sounded hostile, and Emily promised, with the brave confidence of someone spending other people's patience, that she would cover utilities as soon as she caught her breath and would move out as soon as she got her feet under her, and I chose to believe her because believing people you love costs less up front, while the deed and the mortgage and the property taxes stayed very real and very mine, and the auto debits and maintenance appointments and the delivery of a new water heater that I paid for in one long breath stayed mine as well, and when I occasionally suggested that we put something in writing just so we were all clear, my mother would sigh about how families do not need contracts and my father would say that lawyers make everything ugly, and Emily would send a long text about gratitude that somehow ended with her explaining why she could not Venmo this month either. There were small patterns that hardened into habits, like the way she occupied not just the guest room, but the garage, and then the hallway closet, and then the pantry, and the way her friends treated my kitchen like a community center, and the way my parents walked in without knocking and left with the comfortable air of people visiting a museum funded by the city, and I told myself that if I could carry this weight a little longer it might transform into something like pride or closeness, but it did not. It just stayed heavy, and I got good at saying it's fine, while setting my own boundaries aside like plates I promised I would wash later. The hardest part was not the money, although money has a way of narrating whose choices counted and whose did not. It was the way my concerns were rebranded as tone problems, because whenever I raised the question of fairness my mother would ask me to be gentle. And whenever I mentioned a deadline or a date my father would remind me that real life is complicated, and whenever I asked Emily for something concrete she would praise my generosity and reroute the conversation to how overwhelmed she was and how much better she was getting and how this next job would fix everything, and because I am not a monster I chose hope more often than not, which turned me into the kind of landlord who apologizes for asking that the rent be paid. Except I never asked for rent at all. When the Hawaii trip took shape without my name on it, the math snapped into sharp focus, because it is one thing to choose generosity and another thing entirely to watch generosity be treated like a permanent discount code. And as I sat with my tea and the quiet of a house I paid for, I realized that I had done something I promised myself I would never do, which is to manage the feelings of everyone in the room at the cost of abandoning my own. And if I was going to stop that pattern, I had to start with the only lever I truly controlled, the roof over our heads and the door that determined who had a right to walk through it. I pulled the folder where I keep boring documents that have saved me more than once, and I looked at the copy of the deed with my name spelled correctly, and I read the notes from a conversation I had months ago with a local attorney who had explained, in neutral and non-judgmental language, that a family member living as a guest is a licensee, not a tenant, and that a simple written notice revoking permission is not cruel or theatrical. It is an adult step that resets a boundary that should never have been allowed to blur in the first place, and I felt the strange calm that arrives when the options are not actually complicated, only emotionally expensive. Because I still believe in giving people a fair warning even when they never gave me one, I drafted a letter that was not angry and not dramatic, only clear, stating that the guest arrangement was over and that personal belongings needed to be removed by a specific date. And I printed it and placed it in an envelope addressed to Emily, because regardless of how this went, I wanted a record that I chose clarity over chaos, and as I sealed it, I finally understood that kindness without boundaries is not kindness at all, it is avoidance dressed up in a pretty sweater. I did one more thing that felt small in the moment and enormous an hour later, which was to open the Home app on my phone and remove her device from the list of trusted users, because if you are going to draw a line, you cannot leave the gate propped open just in case. And while my finger hovered over the setting for the garage keypad, I remembered the way my father's voice sounded when he called me reasonable, and I decided to let the adults be reasonable on their own time, since my time was finally mine again, and with the envelope on my passenger seat and a quiet certainty in my chest, I made one additional call to a number I had tucked away months ago when it first occurred to me that a boundary can sometimes be made of brass and steel. And when the calm voice on the other end asked what day worked best, I gave a date that lined up perfectly with a certain set of flights and a very empty driveway, then said I would be home to let them in the morning they flew out. I brewed coffee that I actually drank while it was still hot, and I looked around the kitchen I paid for and the hall where her boxes had multiplied like rabbits, and I made the small, but decisive choice to stop narrating my disappointment and start acting like the person whose name is on the papers. So I opened my calendar, confirmed the time I had set with the locksmith a while back when this plan was only a quiet possibility I was almost afraid to admit to myself. And I sat with the steadiness that comes when you finally choose the simplest path, even if it will make other people call you harsh. Then I moved through the house and collected the extra keys that had drifted into bowls and drawers and the bottom of handbags. Because in my family, boundaries have a way of dissolving into clutter, and I was done pretending that open access was a sign of love rather than laziness. When the locksmith arrived with a neutral smile and a toolbox that made a comforting clink as he set it down, I walked him through the front door, the back door, and the garage entry. And I asked for a high-security keyway that cannot be duplicated at a kiosk next to the soda machine, and he nodded in that way tradespeople do when you have clearly thought this through. And as the old cylinders came out and the new ones slid in with small mechanical sighs, I felt something uncoil between my shoulders. Not triumph exactly, and not cruelty, but the relief of finally placing a lock where there had only been a hope, while I also asked him to reset the deadbolt on the side gate because a boundary should not have gaps. And when he suggested I might want new strike plates, I said yes to those as well, since doing it right the first time is a lesson I seem to absorb only after doing it wrong for a very long time. Before he left, I paid the invoice without flinching because this was not a petty move or a moment of rage. This was maintenance of a thing I own and a line I should have drawn much earlier, and I took the new keys and made exactly 3 copies, one for me, one for a lockbox that lives with my will and the boring documents that keep me safe, and one for a trusted neighbor who has seen enough of the comings and goings to understand that serenity sometimes looks like a changed cylinder. And I wrote down the key numbers and stapled the receipt to my folder. Because there is a special kind of peace in knowing that the future argument someone plans to have with you will dissolve the moment you pull out a piece of paper with dates and signatures and the crisp edges of reality on your side. I had already prepared a letter that was not a manifesto, not a list of her failures, and not a plea to remember what I have done for her, but a straight line of facts presented without a tremor, stating that the guest arrangement had ended, that the locks had been changed to secure the property, that her personal items were packed into clearly labeled bins which I had moved into a small storage unit in her name, the first month paid in full so she could pick up her things without having to invent a crisis at the counter, and that any mail addressed to her would be forwarded for a limited time. I placed a copy of that letter on the entry table for my own records, sent another via certified mail, and scheduled an email with the storage code to arrive on the evening their plane was due to land, because I wanted the message to be calm, complete, and impossible to twist into the drama she prefers to serve when the facts do not hug her back. Packing her belongings took less time than I expected because chaos always feels bigger when it is loose, and when you strip it down to shoes, toiletries, a mountain of clothes with tags still attached, some kitchen gadgets she insisted she needed and never unboxed, and a collection of framed affirmations that seemed a little too confident given the rent situation, you realize that the weight you have been carrying is not just stuff, but the permission you keep renewing without reading the terms. So I put each bin together with a small index card on top listing what was inside, snapped a photo for my records, and loaded them into a van with the help of a mover who did not ask questions because professionalism is a bomb. I took one last walk through the rooms, not to soak in any sentimentality, but to check outlets and windows and the small things that become big when you overlook them. And I noted the scuffed baseboard I will paint next weekend and the cabinet hinge that needs a new screw. Then I closed the door and locked it with a key that answers to me. And I stood there with my palm on the cool metal for a long breath while my phone buzzed with a photo from the family chat of my parents in matching lace and my sister leaning into the frame with that smile that says she has pulled it off again, and instead of replying I put the phone back in my pocket and mailed the certified letter, because there are moments when silence is not surrender, it is structure. I did not tell her, because the point of a boundary is not to perform it, the point is to live inside it, so I went home, made dinner, and watched a movie whose ending I actually saw without pausing for a panic text. And then I slept the kind of sleep you get when the house you own is finally functioning the way a house should, as a shelter rather than a stage, and in the morning when the airline tracker showed their return flight pushing across the map, I felt that electric mix of nerves and composure that arrives right before a showdown, and instead of rehearsing speeches, I placed the spare keys in the safe, opened the email scheduler to confirm the message would go out with the storage access and the clear notice. And I left my phone on the table with the volume turned up, because the door would now speak first, and the sound it made would be beautifully simple. The first call hit before Dawn had decided what kind of day it wanted to be, the ringtone slicing through the quiet with that particular urgency people adopt when they believe panic will make you forget what you know. And on the line was Emily, breathing fast and performing shock, insisting that her key did not work and that maybe the door was jammed and that I should hurry over because the neighbors were watching and she could not stand there like some trespasser on a porch that had seen more of her than it ever saw of me. And I let her empty the bag of outrage while I sipped water and reminded her in a voice I use for customer service and medical forms that a letter had been sent, an email scheduled, a storage unit secured, and that her belongings were safe and accessible with the code arriving in her inbox that evening, after which she could arrange a pickup time that did not involve theatrics on my steps, at which point she shifted to the weepy register and asked how I could do this during the holidays and whether I had any idea how cruel I sounded, and I said I do not sound cruel, I sound clear, and then I ended the call because clarity does not ask for applause and boundaries do not require permission to stand. The second call came from my mother, who announced before I could say hello that I had humiliated my sister and that the neighbors could see her standing outside like a stray, and she moved quickly to the old arguments, to family loyalty and compassion, and how I have always been so strong and could not I be strong one more time, while Emily stabilized, and I let her speak until she ran out of air, and then I told her, with the patience of someone laying bricks instead of throwing them, that I had been strong for years and that strength is not an endless buffet you can graze at without paying the bill, and that the guest license was revoked, the access removed, The notice delivered according to the advice I had taken months ago when it first became obvious that my generosity had turned into their entitlement, and my mother tried the sentence about how a good daughter would not lock out family. And I countered with the sentence that a good daughter does not allow herself to be used like a free concierge who cannot even sit at the table she paid to set, and when she raised her voice I ended that call as well, because part of growing up is choosing which sounds are allowed inside your home and which belong on the other side of a door. By mid-morning the group chat churned like a dryer on a bad bearing, with cousins chiming in from airports and my father typing long paragraphs filled with phrases like fix this and undo this and one bad decision. And I kept my hands off the keyboard because I had already communicated everything that mattered in writing where the facts could not be edited by adrenaline. And instead, I opened the home router settings and removed devices that had been drinking my bandwidth for months. I reset the Wi-Fi to a name that made me laugh and a password that did not. I deauthorized the streaming services I had been too tired to notice were logged in everywhere she ever visited. And I called the utility company to roll back the usage alerts I had increased when the house turned into a revolving door. Small administrative moves that do not photograph well, but that return a person's life to them one checkbox at a time. The doorbell camera caught what dignity refused to, which was my sister attempting to sweet-talk the neighbor into letting her through the side gate, and then rattling the handle like a movie extra hoping the props department had forgotten to do its job. And, because I prefer records to anecdotes, I saved the clip in a folder labeled in a way that future me would find immediately, and I texted my neighbor a thank you for not engaging beyond a polite hello, and I made a note with the non-emergency case number I had obtained the previous week when I called to file a courtesy notice that the permission for a family member to enter had been revoked. Not because I planned to escalate, but because I had finally learned that a boundary with documentation stands taller than a boundary that relies on people remembering what they once agreed to when they were not hungry and embarrassed. When my parents decided to come over in person, announcing themselves by text from the driveway like dignitaries escorting a crisis, I met them on the porch rather than inviting them in, and I spoke slowly and without heat about the letter, the storage unit, the pickup window, the fact that I was not negotiating the existence of the lock or the terms of access to my own property, and I watched their faces cycle through disbelief and indignation to the place where power recognizes it has found friction, and I held there, steady and boring as a policy manual, while my mother asked me to at least let Emily inside to use the bathroom, and my father asked whether I understood how this looked, and I said I do. It looks like an adult enforcing a rule that should have been respected without the need for speeches. And if they wanted to discuss anything further, we could schedule a meeting at a neutral place, with a third party present so no one could claim later that emotions hid the facts, and then I stepped back and ended the visit by doing the thing they least expected, which was closing the door first and letting the lock say the last word. That evening I sent a single message to the family chat that was so dry you could light a match with it, a list of 3 sentences that confirmed the end of the guest arrangement, the location of the belongings, and the email address dedicated to coordinating pickup. And I closed with a line that landed like a gavel without the theater, stating that future home access would not be discussed by phone or in any informal chat, and that any attempt to enter without permission would be treated as a safety issue, not a family drama, after which my phone began vibrating like a trapped thing, and I set it face down and made dinner, because you cannot soothe a storm by standing in it with your mouth open. The next morning, after a quiet night where nothing terrible happened, because nothing terrible needed to happen, an envelope slid through my mail slot with my father's careful handwriting on the front, and I opened it to find a note that was half apology and half demand along with a copied key that would no longer fit anything I owned. And I smiled in a way that had nothing to do with joy, because it confirmed what I had suspected for years, that they did not hate boundaries, they only hated boundaries that worked. And as I tucked the key into the folder with the deed and the receipts and the case number, I thought about the final piece I had set in motion that none of them knew about yet. The piece that would not only end the argument, but also remove the lever they had leaned on my whole adult life. And I realized with a calm I could feel in my hands that when they asked to fix it, what they really meant was to fix me back into place. A position I had already dismantled, which meant The last move would be quiet, clean, and irreversible. When the noise finally softened into that thin, exhausted silence families use when they have run out of speeches, but have not yet run out of entitlement, I set the meeting they kept demanding at a neutral coffee shop with tables too small for theatrics. And I arrived with a folder that did not look dramatic because drama was never the point, and before anyone could start reciting their preferred version of duty and sacrifice, I laid out, in a voice I could keep steady even if theirs could not, that while they were enjoying their holiday, I had done the one thing I should have done the moment I realized kindness, without structure, turns into a trap, which was to take the house out of the arena of feelings and place it squarely inside the arena of contracts, policies, and consequences. I told them that the storage unit remained available for a set window that had been clearly stated, that any items not collected by the end of that window would be considered abandoned and handled by the facility according to their standard procedures, and that the email address I had created for coordinating logistics was still the only channel I would use, not because I was being cold, but because I was done letting emergency tones erase prior agreements. Then I opened the folder and slid across a copy of a signed lease that begins on the first day of the new year, a simple document written in language any adult can understand, a 1-year term with renewal options, market rate rent that will wire directly to the mortgage account without visiting my checking at all, and a clause specifying that only the named tenants and their registered guests may enter the property, which means that no one, not a sister with a story nor a parent with a lecture, has a right to step over the threshold without violating a contract that does not include my patience as an addendum. I explained that I had hired a property management company whose entire business is enforcing boundaries for people who do not want to argue with relatives at their own doors, and that the company had conducted background checks, taken an inventory of fixtures, swapped in their own lockbox, and placed the property under 24-hour monitoring that sends alerts to them and not to me, which means that any future conversation about maintenance, noise, or access belongs to a trained professional with a clipboard and a van, and while I will always own what I own, I will no longer volunteer to be everyone's receptionist, mediator, and cleanup crew simply because I am nearby and female and used to saying yes. My father reached for the lease with a shakiness that lives somewhere between anger and fear, asked if the tenants could be delayed, suggested that perhaps a month of grace could be found. And I replied with a calm that had taken me years to earn that the tenants are an oncology nurse and a community college instructor who signed because they were told the home would be theirs on the date in the contract, and that I would not be the kind of landlord who treats other people's stability like a lever for family negotiations. Then my mother tried the old line about how this would humiliate Emily beyond repair, and I answered that humiliation is not walking into a locked door you were warned about. Humiliation is being so certain your sister will fold that you forget to treat her as a person with agency and a spine. I placed one more document on the table, not as a threat but as evidence that I had graduated from wishful thinking. A notice prepared by an attorney confirming that permission to enter had been revoked and that any further attempts would be documented and pursued through proper channels, and I said that I hoped never to use it because I still prefer dinners to depositions. Yet I had learned the simple truth that only a fool builds a boundary without a post and a sign, after which I closed the folder, folded my hands, and let the quiet do whatever work it could. The final message to Emily went out that afternoon, and it was not a flourish, just a plain list of remaining pickup slots, the storage unit address, the code, and the reminder that her name had been removed from my accounts, my Wi-Fi, my emergency contacts, and the family phone plan she had somehow convinced me to keep covering during her many fresh starts. And as my finger hovered over send, I understood that this was the end of a season where love meant debt and silence meant consent, and that stepping out of that season would not make me righteous, it would make me responsible, which is less glamorous, but much more durable. They did what families do when their favorite tool stops working. They called it punishment, they called it cold, they called it ungrateful, and then, when none of that, opened a door that now answers to contracts instead of moods. They called it overreaction and asked how to fix it, and I said there is nothing to fix because nothing is broken. This is what health looks like when you are used to chaos, and if they want a relationship that does not starve me, they can meet me where adults meet one. Another, which is on ground that is level and named plainly. On the day the tenants moved in, the moving truck angled into the driveway like a promise kept. The property manager handed them keys that did not pass through my family's fingers, and I watched from my car long enough to make sure the paperwork matched the reality. Then I drove to my small rented place where no one has a code and no one drops by to audit my tone, and I made a quiet dinner and let myself feel both the grief of what I had tried to hold together and the relief of no longer being held hostage by it. And when my phone lit up one more time with the familiar plea to fix things, I looked at the lease, at the stamped certified receipts, at the tidy row of keys that no longer multiply in random drawers. And I understood with something close to joy that I had not burned a bridge. I had replaced a drawbridge with a road that leads in only when invited, which is to say I won, not by shouting or breaking or begging, but by building something that does not require their permission to stand.